From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, ask the follow button to go on a long hike with you, but before you go, superglue a tiny pebble inside one of their shoes. It's common wisdom that diet and exercise are the best ways to maintain your health. As they say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But sometimes, no matter how fanatical you are about counting calories and getting daily exercise, there's just nothing you can do to keep certain illnesses at bay. And on this episode, we have two stories about extremely healthy people who find themselves fighting off strange, deadly conditions. The first story is about a marathon runner who suddenly goes through a drastic lifestyle change with no explanation. And the second and final story is about an active older woman who unexpectedly finds herself in the hospital, with doctors struggling to figure out what's wrong with her before it's too late. And now here's our first story called No Reservations. On a sunny morning in 1993, 42-year-old Roberto Nunez was on his daily run through his hometown of Granada, Spain. And as usual, along this route, he ran past delivery trucks parked outside of restaurants, and kitchen workers carried crates of food from these trucks into the back of the restaurants to prepare for the day's meals. Now, Roberto had never really paid these restaurants much attention. He was an athlete, and to him, food was just fuel, not some delicacy. But that morning, right after passing by the restaurant and smelling the smells of the food, he happened to run past a local bookshop. And for whatever reason, something in that bookshop caught his eye. It was a fine dining cookbook, beautifully displayed in the front window. And for some reason, Roberto stopped his run and just stared at this cookbook. Something about the meal on the cover just looked irresistible. He was so drawn to it, he could almost taste the food in his mouth. Moments later, Roberto found himself inside the bookstore, asking for a copy of that book. As the shopkeeper went to go get a copy of this book, Roberto wandered toward the culinary section of the store and began flipping through the other cookbooks. And by the time the shopkeeper returned, Roberto had a whole pile of them in his arms. When Roberto left the bookshop, he couldn't run anymore because of how heavy all these books were he'd just bought, and so he walked his way home. And then when he got home, he lined up all of his beautiful new cookbooks on his kitchen counter and just stared for a second, marveling at all the food on the covers. Then he went to his refrigerator to grab a container of yogurt, his usual breakfast. But now, as he stared down at the cup of plain, unflavored goop, his tongue seemed to recoil inside of his mouth. He felt like he could almost taste the plastic container and metal spoon before he even took a bite. Suddenly, Roberto's everyday breakfast seemed totally unappealing. And so for the first time in his entire adult life, Roberto decided to take himself out for breakfast. He walked to the nearest open cafe and read their extensive menu, and all the items sounded delicious. Unable to choose, he just asked the server to bring him the most popular dish and one of every side dish on the menu. 20 minutes later, Roberto's little cafe table was so full of plates, he could barely find a spot to set down his espresso mug. Roberto stuck his fork into a potato omelet seasoned with chives and garlic. He took a bite, and it felt like his tongue was exploding with pleasure. He'd had all these foods before, but they had never triggered a response like this. He felt a rush of joy as he leaned over his cafe table and devoured every bit of food his stomach could fit. A few weeks later, Roberto was pacing in his kitchen on the phone, making reservations at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Granada. For the past couple of weeks, he and his wife had been eating out for almost every meal. Roberto didn't know what had come over him. He'd never been a food person, but now he was spending nearly all his time researching the best restaurants in Granada and then making plans to dine at each of them. Meanwhile, his running shoes sat abandoned in his closet. In fact, he hadn't gone running even once this week. Roberto was a marathon runner, but his heart just was not in running anymore. He'd totally stopped counting calories and monitoring his carbohydrate and protein intake. His only long-term goal at the moment was a grand European road trip so he could try all the famous restaurants he'd been reading about. In fact, calling a travel agent was the next item on his to-do list. He intended to eat at every single Michelin-rated restaurant in the entire world. Roberto finalized another restaurant reservation and then hung up, marking the appointment on his calendar, and then he called the next restaurant on his list. 4 years later, Roberto sat at his computer typing up a restaurant review. By this point, his entire life now revolved around food. Every free second was spent eating, planning to eat, or traveling to the best restaurants all over the world so that he could write about them. Roberto looked a lot different now, too. Roberto had really not been running at all over the past few years, and between that and his sedentary lifestyle and new love of gourmet food, he'd gained a good 60 pounds. He'd had to buy a completely new wardrobe, but Roberto didn't mind. He'd actually never had so much fun in his life as he had now being a foodie. The passion he now felt for food rivaled the sense of accomplishment he used to feel at the end of marathons. It was like he had finally found his real life's purpose. Roberto sat back in his home office chair and closed his eyes, trying to remember the subtlety of a glaze he'd tasted at lunch. He breathed in deeply, then sat up looking around. He breathed in again, and a warm, savory scent filled his nostrils. His entire apartment was suddenly filled with this heavenly aroma, even though he wasn't cooking anything at all. It took him a minute to place this wonderful smell, and then he had it. It was his mother's cooking, a spicy potato dish she used to make him when he was a kid. Confused, Roberto went to the kitchen, wondering if maybe his wife had come home and started making dinner without him noticing, but no, the kitchen was dark and empty. So Roberto wandered the house, running scenarios through his mind that might explain the smell. At first he thought, maybe a window was open and outside smells were coming in. But when that wasn't true, he began to wonder, did somebody break in and were they eating inside of his house? Now he knew that made no sense, but the more he wandered the house, the stronger the smell of his mother's cooking became, but there was no reason for it to be in his apartment. It just made no sense. Roberto was feeling freaked out, especially when, moments later, the smell changed from delicious to sour. He stopped and covered his nose as a chemical-like odor filled the apartment. But even with his nose covered, he could still smell it. Worse, he could taste it on his tongue. He gagged a little, then went to the kitchen to spit in the sink. He flung a window open, trying to air out the smell, and then as quickly as the smell had come on, it disappeared. Roberto stood in his living room feeling very unnerved, trying to tell himself that there had to be some rational explanation here. He told himself that it must have been a neighbor cooking a familiar recipe and accidentally burning it on the stove. But despite his best efforts to convince himself that that really happened, he still felt very unsettled as he went back to his computer to finish his review. A month later, Roberto was at a local cafe enjoying one of his favorite breakfasts, a potato and chorizo omelet with a side of fruit and some bread. He'd just finished slathering the bread with some butter when his nose caught a whiff of that same savory scent he had smelled inside of his apartment. The smell was his mother's cooking, specifically her huevos rotos, a traditional Spanish breakfast she used to make when he was a kid. Roberto looked around, wondering if the smell was coming from a neighboring table, but he was the only one with a plate of food. Roberto picked up his espresso and breathed in deeply, knowing the smell of coffee beans can clear your palate. But when he set the cup down again, that smell was still there. Roberto told himself not to panic, but he was worried. He decided that perhaps it was time to see a doctor about all these phantom smells. A few days later, Roberto was at a neurologist's office explaining how he was smelling all these things that weren't actually there, and he was concerned that he was losing his mind. Now, the neurologist didn't want Roberto to panic, but he did think Roberto might be experiencing smell hallucinations. And they're rare, but very real, and they can be the sign of something dangerous. The doctor explained that smell hallucinations can be caused by head injuries, upper respiratory infections, and in some cases, brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Roberto did his best to stay calm. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he got here today, but certainly not being told he could have a brain tumor or Parkinson's disease. The neurologist could clearly read the fear in Roberto's eyes because he immediately told him, don't worry. They'd run some tests and narrow down the possibilities, then figure out what was going on. They'd start by ordering an MRI. Roberto nodded, still feeling very uneasy. And a few hours later, his unease quickly turned to fear as the neurologist showed Roberto his MRI scan and pointed to a long, slender tumor on his right temporal lobe of his brain. Roberto felt petrified as the neurologist explained that the tumor was called a fibroblastic meningioma. It was putting pressure on Roberto's brain and causing him to have these smell hallucinations. The doctor explained that they'd have to surgically remove this tumor. Roberto felt a surge of adrenaline as he imagined himself undergoing brain surgery. He was going to be sick. He bent over, his arms on his knees, trying to catch his breath. And at the same time, the neurologist assured him that they would take very good care of him. The doctor said he would be with Roberto every step of the way. Roberto stood up and nodded. He knew he needed to call his wife and break the terrible news. But then after that, he would call his favorite restaurant to get takeout for dinner. He was in the mood for some comfort food. A few weeks later, Roberto was at home on his couch watching his favorite cooking show on TV. His head was still bandaged from his 14-hour brain surgery, which his neurologist said had been a success, and Roberto had been making slow but steady progress in his recovery. As he flipped through the channels, the mouth-watering smell of roasted chicken suddenly filled the room. And for a second, Roberto was terrified. Was this another smell hallucination? Did the surgery not work? But then he looked up and saw his wife enter the living room carrying 2 plates of roasted chicken, his dinner. His stomach rumbled, and he thanked his wife as she set his plate down on the coffee table and helped him sit upright. Roberto had not had a single smell hallucination since his surgery, and he was hoping that that meant he was cured. And so, feeling like he had a new lease on life, Roberto looked forward to getting back to his food blog and the long list of restaurants he still wanted to try. 12 years later, on March 3, 2010, Roberto, who was now 58 years old, stood on the scale at his neurologist's office for a routine follow-up. Even though it had been over a decade since his brain surgery, he still had to get regular MRI scans to make sure there was no new tumors in his brain. The nurse took note of Roberto's weight. By this point, Roberto had gained approximately 110 pounds since he first took an interest in food. But this just didn't really bother him. He knew he'd been gaining weight steadily over the years, because after all, he ate rich and decadent foods for almost every meal, something he just loved to do. And besides, his career in food had really become quite incredible. Roberto was now a widely recognized and respected food critic. He wrote for prestigious magazines and gastronomy guides, and had been featured in a few newspapers. After that day's scan, Roberto waited inside of his neurologist's office, expecting the same results he got after every other appointment, all clear and good to go. Except this afternoon, his neurologist did not look too happy when he came through the door. He told Roberto that the MRI today showed a growing lesion and mild damage in the same areas where his tumor had been, and he believed that the lesion was likely left over from his surgery a decade ago. Roberto was shocked and asked the doctor if this meant more brain surgery. But the neurologist assured Roberto that this lesion was small. So small, in fact, they could very likely manage it without having to resort to surgery. Instead, they would do something called radiosurgery, which is when very focused beams of radiation are used to treat cancer cells in other tissue without any incision. Roberto liked the sound of that and scheduled the radiosurgery for later that week. A month later, Roberto parked his car along a street in Granada and adjusted his tie. Then he opened the passenger door for his wife, and the two of them began walking up the sidewalk on their way to a restaurant opening. And as they strolled along the boulevard, Roberto told his wife the good news. He'd had a follow-up doctor's appointment at his neurologist that afternoon. He'd completed his radiosurgery appointments at the start of the month, and now his neurologist told him that his lesion had shrunk by more than 25% and was no longer pressing on his temporal lobe. His neurologist felt optimistic that the lesion would soon be gone, and Roberto would be in full remission. As they neared the restaurant, Roberto's wife gave him a kiss and told him this was fantastic news. She was so relieved. Then the hostess led Roberto and his wife to their table and removed the shiny gold reserved placard as they sat down. The new restaurant was buzzing with anticipation. It was chock full of well-dressed diners, all clearly looking forward to an excellent night of food. A server came out to pour wine, and moments later, Roberto's first course was set down in front of him. But for some reason, it didn't look appetizing. He stared down at the food, trying to conjure some of the excitement he'd been feeling just moments ago, but he couldn't have been less interested. In fact, he kind of just wanted to leave and go home and get a good night's sleep. But Roberto was a professional, so he made himself eat every course they brought out to him. However, later that night, when he was working on the review, Roberto had to admit that his heart just wasn't in it. And so for the first time in more than 15 years, food just didn't really interest him. And the next time Roberto saw his neurologist, he learned why. It would turn out the tumor and lingering lesion pressing on Roberto's temporal lobe, known as the amygdala, was what had caused not only his hallucinatory smells, but his extreme interest in food. The pressure from the tumor created a brain injury, which in very rare cases can trigger a bizarre brain and eating disorder called gourmand syndrome. People who suffer from this condition can literally become completely obsessed with fine dining. They become preoccupied with food and sometimes become compulsive eaters, even if they had formerly been very health conscious. And that's exactly what happened to Roberto. Once Roberto's tumor was removed and the lesion was finally reduced, Roberto's love for food basically completely faded. However, despite that, Roberto did not give up on his career. He kept working as a food critic, even if his job was not nearly as enjoyable as it was before. And now, here is our second and final story of today's episode, called The Bitter End. One morning in 2022, a 64-year-old woman named Beth shuffled into her kitchen in Ontario, Canada. It was early, and so Beth was still wearing her pajamas. She opened up her kitchen window to let fresh air blow inside, and as she did, she took in a deep breath and smiled. Beth always reminded herself not to take life's small pleasures, like a cool summer breeze, for granted. She grabbed a loaf of whole wheat bread off the counter and put 2 slices in the toaster. Then she opened her fridge and pulled out a container of green juice and a couple of organic eggs. Beth was extremely health and diet conscious and usually had this same breakfast every morning. She drank 2 glasses of juice while her toast cooked, and she scrambled her eggs. Then she sat at the kitchen table to eat. When she finished, she put her dishes in the sink and walked back to her room to get dressed for her morning jog. But as she was trying to decide what shirt to wear, Beth felt this dull pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she was able to ignore it, but then the pain got sharper and Beth suddenly was clutching her stomach. And then she felt weak, and a wave of nausea made her rush from her closet to her bathroom, where she vomited and then had diarrhea. Beth shakily walked to the sink and drank a few sips of water from the tap. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was beet red. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her throat, and so she brought 2 fingers up to her neck and began to count her pulse. And she found her heart was absolutely racing, and it really scared her because she had high blood pressure, and so she knew, at any point, something could go wrong with her heart. And so suddenly, Beth feared she might be having a heart attack. She stumbled back to her kitchen, she grabbed her landline phone off the counter, and she dialed 911. Less than half an hour later, Dr. Jacob Adams heard a siren blaring as an ambulance pulled up outside of the University of Ottawa's Montfort Hospital. A paramedic hopped out of the back of the vehicle and rushed into the emergency room, shouting to the doctor that, "Hey, we have a patient who's in shock here." And so Dr. Adams immediately ran with the paramedic out towards the ambulance, knowing he had a very sick patient on his hands. Shock occurs when a person doesn't have enough blood circulating throughout their body, and left untreated, it can rapidly lead to organ damage or even death. And this patient, Beth, was already in bad shape. The paramedic said that she was vomiting, she had diarrhea, and her blood pressure was dangerously high. Another paramedic followed closely behind the first, and together, they brought Beth into the emergency room on a gurney. Dr. Adams saw how pale and confused she looked, and knew there was no time to waste. He directed the EMT to wheel Beth into the nearest exam room, while the other paramedic briefed him on Beth's medical history. They told the doctor that Beth had been relatively healthy until today, but she had been taking medications for 2 conditions, high blood pressure and a thyroid deficiency that can leave patients feeling tired and looking pale. Otherwise, she was taking no other drugs. She didn't even take vitamins or over-the-counter supplements. The paramedic said Beth had deteriorated right before their eyes. When they first arrived at Beth's house, she was able to talk to them about her fear that she was maybe having a heart attack. But since then, she had gotten so much sicker that now she could barely talk. Dr. Adams nodded and thanked the paramedics for bringing her in. Then he watched as the ER nurses went to work on their very unstable patient. One nurse checked Beth's temperature, another inserted an IV needle, and a third wrapped a blood pressure monitor around her arm. At first, it showed that Beth's blood pressure was elevated, but suddenly, it plummeted 100 points. Beth's arms went limp, and she looked like she was struggling to breathe. And so within seconds, Beth's blood pressure had gone from being dangerously high to being so low that she could lose consciousness any second. Dr. Adams took one of Beth's hands and squeezed her fingers, making her skin turn white. He waited for the color where he squeezed to come back, but it took an unusually long time. To Dr. Adams, this was extremely worrying. It meant Beth's blood circulation had become dangerously sluggish. Before they could do anything else, Dr. Adams knew he would need to stabilize Beth's condition. He asked a nurse to start her on an IV fluid drip, and almost as soon as the fluids entered Beth's bloodstream, her blood pressure started rising and her breathing returned to normal. After a few minutes, Beth began to speak, albeit in a strained voice, saying that her stomach was killing her. She said she kept getting these horrible, sharp cramps in her lower abdomen. Dr. Adams assured Beth they would figure out what was going on, but they had to perform a lot of different tests as quickly as possible to do that. And so he told her the best thing she could do was try to stay calm and just focus on her breathing. Beth looked scared, but nodded her head in agreement. Then Dr. Adams called in 3 different medical technicians who all surrounded Beth. One of them took vials of her blood, another examined her abdomen with an ultrasound machine, while the third performed an EKG to test her heart function. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams stood off to the side and considered all of his patient's symptoms, and he began to think about a couple of different things that could have caused her to go into shock. Maybe she was having an allergic reaction, or maybe she swallowed some kind of poison, or maybe she was fighting a severe infection. Now, the first two, allergic reaction and poison, were tough to address right now, but the severe infection could be treated right away. So Dr. Adams called for a nurse to start Beth on broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping this would stop a potential infection in its tracks. While a nurse gave Beth a dose of antibiotics through her IV tube, one of the medical technicians finished taking Beth's blood. Dr. Adams told him to have the blood tested for signs of infection, and also to run an emergency toxicology test to see if there were any traces of poison inside of Beth's body. At almost the same time, the ultrasound technician pulled up black and white images of Beth's digestive system onto a computer screen and told Dr. Adams that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, like fluid buildup or a bowel obstruction. However, the technician who was doing the EKG had much more ominous news. They said the left side of Beth's heart was working much harder than it should have been, a sign that her heart was not functioning correctly. It could mean that the right side of her heart was failing, and so as a result, the left side was trying to make up for it, which Dr. Adams knew could easily put Beth's life in danger. But, alarming as the EKG results were, they didn't help Dr. Adams determine what was actually causing Beth's intense distress. He needed to get a better understanding of how all of her internal organs were functioning. So he decided to bring her into the radiology department for a CT scan, which would take pictures of the inside of her body. The scan only took about 15 minutes, but it revealed that Beth's problems went beyond her heart. Dr. Adams saw that her small intestine showed signs of inflammation or even a possible obstruction. Though the earlier ultrasound of her abdomen had looked normal, the doctor no longer believed that was accurate. He could tell from the more detailed CT scan that something was wrong after all. And suddenly, Dr. Adams had an alarming thought. Maybe Beth was bleeding internally inside of her digestive system. Severe internal bleeding could explain a lot of Beth's symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and her sudden drop in blood pressure. But this would be a terrifying diagnosis. If Dr. Adams didn't locate and stop the bleeding right away, Beth could bleed to death. A few minutes later, Dr. Adams received the results of Beth's blood work. Her toxicology report came back normal, meaning technicians had not found any poison in her system, but on the other hand, the results showed she did have elevated levels of a protein found in red blood cells, which did seem to indicate she did have internal bleeding. And just as the doctor set her test results aside, Beth's blood pressure suddenly plummeted again. She went pale and her breathing became labored. Dr. Adams looked up and noticed her IV fluid bag was empty, so he quickly replaced it with a full one, and as soon as the fluids flowed into her system, just like the last time, her blood pressure immediately stabilized. But to Dr. Adams, this was not a good sign. If Beth was rapidly bleeding internally, IV fluids would keep her going for a while, but eventually it would not be enough, and so she needed a blood transfusion as quickly as possible. And at this point, Beth looked sicker than ever. She groaned in pain and then leaned over the side of her hospital bed and vomited up blood. Now, Dr. Adams was certain that she was bleeding internally into her stomach, which was why she was throwing up the blood. He immediately called in a nurse, who began giving Beth a blood transfusion. He also continued giving her IV fluids and started her on drugs that would keep her blood pressure up and reduce acid in the stomach to hopefully slow the bleeding. After all that, Dr. Adams transferred Beth to the intensive care unit, where they met with a gastrointestinal specialist named Dr. Christina King. Dr. King said she needed to insert a tiny camera down Beth's throat and into her abdomen. That way, she could see firsthand where the blood was coming from. Dr. King turned to Beth, whose face was scrunched up in pain, and explained the procedure. Beth would be put under light anesthesia for about 30 minutes, and during that time, Dr. King would insert a tube with the camera on one end into Beth's esophagus and down into her stomach. Beth looked uneasy, but she was so sick that a tube going down her throat seemed like a small price to pay for some answers. She said okay, and the doctors got to work prepping her for the procedure. About 15 minutes later, Beth had been put under anesthesia and was lying on her side on a bed in her ICU room. Dr. King stood beside her and carefully inserted the long, thin tube down her throat. Dr. King could see the inside of Beth's esophagus on a screen right beside her bed. Dr. King moved the tube further down Beth's digestive system, and as soon as the camera entered Beth's stomach, Dr. King saw that her stomach lining was swollen, red, and bleeding. The bleeding was not severe, but the doctor knew that was only thanks to the drugs that Dr. Adams had given Beth. Later that afternoon, Dr. King sat in the ICU with Beth, who was still sedated from her procedure. Beth did look much better than she had just a few hours ago, and Dr. King was glad that the treatment she and Dr. Adams had come up with seemed to be working. Her internal bleeding had largely stopped, at least for now, and so for the time being, Dr. King could really focus on why Beth was bleeding internally. Dr. King was starting to think that Beth's illness had been caused by something that she might have eaten, rather than by poison or an infection. And so once Beth woke up from her procedure, Dr. King asked her if she'd eaten anything out of the ordinary that morning before she'd gotten sick. Beth initially said no. She'd had the same breakfast she ate every single morning: whole wheat toast, organic eggs, and homemade green juice. However, Beth said, now that she thought about it, her juice had tasted a bit more bitter than usual. Dr. King asked what kind of juice it was, and Beth said, she made it herself from a type of green squash called bottle gourds that she had bought at the store. She'd heard that bottle gourds were a really great health food, and so for the last several years, she'd been pureeing the vegetables into a juice that she would drink every morning. Dr. King just stared at Beth, because suddenly she knew what was going on with Beth, and it made perfect sense. Beth had given herself a nearly fatal case of toxic squash syndrome. It's a very rare condition that results from eating poisonous chemicals sometimes found in squashes and gourds. These toxins are called cucurbitacins, and they taste very bitter. Over hundreds of years, people have bred squashes to have only trace levels of these toxins. But sometimes the plants can still develop high amounts of cucurbitacins as they grow, and people who eat a lot of those types of vegetables can get dangerously ill. Beth went to her local grocery store and unknowingly bought bottle gourds that did contain a dangerous amount of these toxins. Then she pureed the vegetables and drank the juice, and the only thing she noticed was a slightly bitter taste, until just minutes after breakfast, the toxins caused her stomach lining to start bleeding, and Beth went into shock. Her case was the first of its kind ever reported in Canada. After 5 days in the ICU, Beth was finally healthy enough to return home. 2 weeks later, her doctors called to check on her condition, and she told them that she was feeling fine, except for one symptom. In the past few days, her hair had begun falling out. Her doctors told her that this was actually normal. Delayed onset hair loss had been reported in a number of cases of toxic squash syndrome. Despite her hair loss, which was actually only temporary, Beth would go on to make a full recovery and go back to her normal life, though she found another kind of juice to drink at breakfast.
So full disclosure, this is not my personal story, but in order to do this story justice, it has to be told in the first person. So I am simply an actor. I was once on a US military ship in the wardroom, which is the officer's lounge, when the operations officer came inside. This guy was the definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, he kind of stumbled in, he was like a zombie holding a bagel. He sits down in front of me, he's barely conscious, and he starts gnawing on his bagel, and I'm sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship. So that's the outside of the ship behind me, and there's a porthole right next to my head where the sun is coming through, and it's hitting this officer directly on his face. And so the officer's looking up at the sun, he's kind of squinting and blocking the sun from his face, and I'm looking at him expecting him to shift left or right to get out of the path of the sunlight. But instead, this officer slowly reaches for the phone on the wall, he brings it up to his head, and he goes, "Yeah, bridge, yeah, this is ops. I need you to adjust our path. Yeah, 156, yep, that's about right. Okay, all right, bye." After he hangs up with the bridge, I'm watching him and he hasn't moved. He's still just looking at the sunlight blazing in on his face. He's just squinting and looking up at it. And then all of a sudden, this port of sunlight just gradually begins to shift off of him and winds up on the wall right behind him where it stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's path just slightly, about 15 degrees, it's enough of a change to reposition the sun from his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move left or right. I'm in awe. I can't believe he's just done this, and for a second, I worry that he won't realize how unbelievably brilliant this was. And then as I'm looking at him, in between bites, he just looks up at me and smiles and goes back to eating his bagel. In November of 2006, Nintendo came out with a brand new gaming console called the Wii, and it was hugely popular and sold out almost completely right away. By the following January, it was still not on shelves in most places around the world, and so people were going crazy, spending unbelievable sums of money to try to get their hands on this system. A Sacramento, California radio station called KDND got a hold of one of these coveted systems and decided they would give it away during an on-air contest. The contest was going to be called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. And the premise of this contest was simple. The contestants would be given lots of water, and the person who held it the longest, i.e. they didn't urinate, would win the prize. Leading up to this contest, the radio station began promoting it really aggressively on air, and lots of people called in with concerns saying that drinking too much water can actually be deadly. But the station brushed these concerns off and said they were aware of them, and that all contestants would be signing a waiver, and so ultimately the station was not responsible for what happened to them. On the morning of Friday, January 12th, 18 contestants showed up at the KDND radio station and they signed their waivers, although one of the contestants said the waiver only covered publicity issues, not health and safety concerns. One of the contestants was 28-year-old Jennifer Strange, who was a mother of 3, and she was trying to win this Wii for her kids. She, along with the others, after signing their waiver, were ushered into this room where they were handed 8-ounce water bottles. Every 15 minutes, they would be expected to finish that water bottle and then refill it and do it every 15 minutes. And if at any point they didn't completely finish their water bottle in time, or if they got up to use the bathroom, they would lose the contest. The contest started at 6:45 a.m. and by 8 a.m., after 5 bottles had been drank, a number of the contestants began pulling themselves out to use the bathroom. But the radio staff felt like this contest was going to take a really long time, and so they gave the remaining contestants, that included Jennifer, a larger bottle of water to drink from. Over the next several hours, all of the contestants, except for Jennifer and one other, had dropped out because it was just too painful. They had to go to the bathroom. Jennifer was heard on air saying it hurt so much, and one of the hosts laughed and said, "Well, do you need to lay down?" And then somebody piped up and said, "She can't even walk." And so everybody just kind of laughed and did nothing about it. Around this time, a nurse called into the radio station and very emphatically said what they were doing, this contest, was a really bad idea. You're gonna get someone killed from water intoxication. Water intoxication is also known as water poisoning, and in a nutshell, what happens is when you drink too much water, the water dilutes your bloodstream, it can cause swelling in your brain, and it can lead to coma and or death. The host, after hearing this concern, turned and yelled to the remaining contestants, "Hey, is anybody dying out there?" And then the host just kind of laughed and hung up on the nurse. A little while later, you can hear one of the hosts on air comment on how Jennifer's belly looked really strange. It had become totally distended and bloated, and they said it looked like she was pregnant. At some point, Jennifer and the other remaining contestant began vomiting, but instead of dropping out, they just continued to drink more water and did not go to the bathroom. But finally, it became too much for Jennifer to bear, and she dropped out of the contest and she relieved herself. For coming in second place, she received tickets to a Justin Timberlake concert. On her drive home, Jennifer began experiencing this horrific headache to the point where she was just sobbing uncontrollably. Through tears, she called one of her coworkers and said she just was not going to be able to come into work that day. Her head hurt too much. And so after she hung up, her coworker she had just spoken to was really concerned about her and called Jennifer's mother to let her know what was going on. And about an hour later, Jennifer's mother headed over to Jennifer's house to check on her, and she found Jennifer dead in her bathroom from water poisoning. The station was ultimately sued by Jennifer's family, and they were ordered to pay over $16 million in damages. In 2005, 57-year-old Stephen Slevin was a physically healthy man, but mentally he was struggling. He was depressed and felt like his life didn't have any purpose anymore, and so in August of that year, he decided to just go on a road trip. He didn't know where he was going. He just felt like if I get out on the road and just go driving somewhere, I will feel better. And on this road trip, he eventually began drinking alcohol, and before long, he was swerving along the New Mexico highway, and a police officer saw his erratic driving and pulled him over. Once Stephen failed his sobriety test, the police officer arrested him. Stephen was brought to a local detention center where during his booking process, it was discovered that he had a history of mental illness. And so the officers, following that county's policy, segregated him from the rest of the general population in an effort to protect Stephen from himself. They moved him into a padded cell on the first floor, they removed all of his clothing, and they put him in what's called a suicide smock, which looks like a big blanket wrapped around your upper body. And what it does is it keeps inmates warm and modest, but it also prevents them from balling up their clothes and creating a noose they could hurt themselves with. After a few days in this padded cell, Stephen was moved to another, better cell that had a window, it had a shower, it had a toilet, and he was there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that are not entirely clear, Stephen, this mentally unstable man, was moved into solitary confinement to await trial for his DWI. Solitary confinement is a type of imprisonment where the inmate is shifted into a single-person cell and they are kept there nearly around the clock without any significant interaction with other people or other inmates. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented and terrifying. Just 15 days into solitary can be enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Stephen's first few weeks in solitary were actually okay. He was allowed to write to his family, he was able to detox and reflect on his life. During those first few weeks, it was noted that Stephen was very polite in his very limited interaction with the officers that were dropping food off through the slot in his door. Also, when Stephen had a few minor medical issues, instead of throwing a fit, he just knocked on the inside of his door and waited patiently for someone to acknowledge him, which took a long time, but he never got frustrated or mad. But by January of 2006, so roughly 3 months into his solitary stint, Stephen had not had any updates on when his case was going to go to trial, and Stephen was starting to lose his grip on reality. He was having these severe panic attacks, and he was suffering from intense hallucinations. He desperately wanted to find out how much longer he was going to be kept in the cell, but nobody would tell him. He tried writing his letters to his family asking for help or asking them to try to get an update on his case, but when he went to literally write the letter, his hand shook so severely from the stress and anxiety that he literally couldn't write these letters. Starting that January, Stephen began spending the bulk of his day in the corner of his cell with his knees tucked up to his chest, rocking back and forth. He was allowed out of his cell a few times a month, but in April of that year, that stopped, and he almost never left his cell again. And without leaving his cell, Stephen was unable to bathe, and so his skin began developing fungus and began falling off, and his teeth began to rot. Finally, on May 8th, 2007, so 1 year and 8 months of being in solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred out of his cell to a behavioral institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. After bathing and shaving and cutting his hair and receiving proper medical treatment, he was back to his normal self within a couple of days. And while he was there, he had a chance to speak to a lawyer, and the lawyer would say the entire meeting, Stephen was just saying, "Where have I been?" And the lawyer said, you've been in solitary confinement awaiting trial. You've been there for almost 2 years. And to that, Stephen was shocked and literally didn't believe him. He actually couldn't remember that time in his life. It was like it had driven him crazy and he had completely repressed it from his memory. But when the lawyer told him about it, it began to come back into his mind, and he begged the lawyer to not let them send him back to solitary confinement. And his lawyer said, unfortunately, if that's where they're going to keep you, that's where they're going to keep you until you have your trial for this DWI. And unfortunately, we have no idea when that trial is going to be. But stay strong, because it's bound to be soon if they've already transferred you to this institute. Stephen stayed at this institute for 2 weeks, and during that time, he asked constantly about when his trial was going to happen, but nobody knew. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken out of his room, put in a van, driven back to New Mexico, and put back into his solitary confinement cell. And immediately, Stephen began to deteriorate. And he begged the guards to not put him in the cell, but nobody was listening, and before long, the door had shut and he was all alone again. Within a couple of days, Stephen developed an abscess in one of his teeth, and he tried to get medical attention, but he didn't get it, and so he sat in the corner of his cell, and for 8 hours one day, he rocked back and forth and violently twisted and yanked and pulled on that tooth until he was able to rip it out of his head. Almost 2 months later, on June 22nd, 2007, Stephen's case was finally put before a judge, and the judge dismissed all of the charges. It's believed the judge found out about this horrible mistreatment of Stephen and took pity on him, but we'll never know. 3 days later, Stephen was released from jail and reunited with his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 2 years without so much as a hearing to tell him what was going on. He had essentially been forgotten about. He would go on to sue the county and win $15.5 million in damages. However, at the same time he's winning this case, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and given less than a year to live. It's unclear if he is alive today. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And I was born November 4th, 1983, to very poor and alcoholic parents in the Ukraine. In the winter of 1986, when Oksana was only 3 years old, in a drunken stupor, her parents forgot about her outside in the cold of winter. And because she was locked out, instinctively she crawled towards the nearest source of warmth, which was the family's kennel, where a whole bunch of dogs were sleeping. And incredibly, once she crawled inside of this kennel, not only did the dogs allow her to sleep there that night, but they kind of embraced her as one of their own. The next day, Oksana did not go back in the house, and her parents seemingly did not notice her absence. And over the next 5 years, Oksana would stay with this family of dogs, essentially living like she was part of their pack, which meant over those 5 very formative years from ages 3 to 8 years old, Oksana had almost no interaction with humans. Oksana rapidly learned how to behave like a dog and began only walking on all fours. She would bark instead of try to speak, and she would eat raw meat. By the early 90s, Oksana no longer identified as a human. She identified as a dog. And it was in the early 90s when a passerby happened to see Oksana running around on all fours in the back of her house in the woods, and they called the police, wondering what was wrong with this person. The police show up, and Oksana's dog family runs out and starts barking at the police to protect Oksana, and Oksana would start barking ferociously to protect herself from being captured. But eventually the police would use meat to lure the rest of the dogs away so they could retrieve the child. When she was taken into custody, doctors saw that she not only had forgotten how to walk on 2 legs, she also couldn't speak. And doctors were concerned that because she had had almost no exposure to human language for all those formative early years, that she might not actually have the capacity to speak anymore. Oksana was taken to an orphanage where she would eventually learn how to walk on 2 legs, and amazingly, she would learn how to speak. But despite these incredible gains she made towards re-entering society, her experience living with the dogs had really left a mark on her. Although she could speak, she could only speak in monotone with no rhythm and no intonation, and it was actually difficult to follow what she was saying because of that. A psychologist did an assessment of Oksana and determined that her mental capacity was only that of a 6-year-old, despite being a young adult at the time of this assessment. By the time she was 22 years years old and had more or less re-entered society, she finally was able to have a boyfriend, and he didn't know much about her past. But when she decided to show him how easy it was for her to run around and bark like a dog, it apparently scared him, and he broke up with her and did not see her again. Today, Oksana lives on a farm taking care of animals, and she was recently interviewed on a Ukrainian talk show where she says she no longer wants to live like or act like a dog, she just wants to be a person. Here is some footage of Oksana Malaya acting like a dog. After being apart for many years, identical twin sisters Ursula and Sabina Eriksson were finally reunited on May 15th, 2008. Within 24 hours of their long-awaited reunion, the 41-year-old Swedish sisters boarded a ferry for Liverpool, England. They arrived in Liverpool at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, May 17th, and their first stop was going to the St. Anne's police station, where Sabina would tell them that she's very concerned for the safety of her kids back in Ireland. The police would say, okay, we'll follow up, and they got in touch with their counterparts in Dublin, Ireland, who went over to the house and everything was fine. So the women leave the police station on foot and they make their way over to a bus stop, and they ultimately board a bus bound for London at about 11:30 in the morning. So they get in the bus and they start moving, and the driver asks them to take their luggage and put it in the luggage hold. But the women aggressively refuse to give up their luggage, and in fact, they start clutching their luggage against their chest. So the driver starts to feel really uncomfortable about having these two women on the bus, and ultimately decides to just pull over at a service station outside of the city and tell them to get off the bus. They get off, and the driver ends up calling the police and telling them there's something weird going on with these two women. I don't know what's inside their bags, but you might want to come check it out. As it happened, there was already a police officer at the service station who came right over to the women and started talking to them as the bus driver took off. During their conversation, the police officer felt like these two women were not a threat to anybody, and it was just a big misunderstanding, and they let them go. So the officer leaves, and these two women who don't have a car start walking down the highway on foot. Shortly thereafter, a security camera on the highway picks up the two women walking down the median of this very busy highway, and at some point they try to cross the street, and it's obvious as you're watching this video that they're not going to make it. There's so many cars, and immediately Sabina gets hit by a car. Now, Sabina was only grazed by the car, so she was okay, and she and her sister went back to the median of this highway, but enough motorists saw this happen that they called the police. And it just so happened that the responding patrol car that was in the area was being shadowed by a film crew that was filming for a TV show called Traffic Cops. So this patrol car shows up with cameras rolling, and they're able to get the sisters from the median over to the shoulder on the other side of the road, and they're talking to them like, what's going on? What are you doing here? And on camera, everything seems totally fine. Like, there is no major issues here. These women were just stranded and were making some bad decisions walking down a highway on foot. Then all of a sudden, Ursula turns away from the officers and tries to run into traffic. And there are cars whizzing by. They have not stopped traffic. And one of the officers manages to grab her arm, but only gets her jacket, which she's able to wriggle out of before launching into traffic, literally leaping into traffic, and gets hit by a huge truck going 60 miles an hour and gets thrown down the road. Literally a second later, as everyone's like, what is going on? Sabina yells, "They're gonna steal your organs!" And she leaps into traffic and gets hit by another car. Immediately, police run in the road, they stop traffic, and they go up to Ursula, who was the first to get hit, and they see her legs are definitely broken, but she's alive. As for Sabina, she was totally unconscious, and they didn't know if she was going to make it. When the paramedics finally show up, Ursula, who has the broken legs, fights to sit up, and they're trying to tell her, like, lay down, you're hurt, you have shattered legs, you're lucky to be alive, lay down. She's not listening. In fact, she's violently trying to sit up, and she starts spitting at the paramedics and the police and screaming obscenities at them like they're trying to hurt her. And they're like, we're the police, we're the paramedics, we're trying to help you. At the same time, Sabina regains consciousness, and even though paramedics and police are trying to keep her laying on the ground, she begins fighting her way up and is pushing the police off of her and finally stands up and literally squares off with one of the police officers and decks her in the face before running down the road. Police would have to run down the road after her and literally surround her as she's got her fists up like she's going to fight anybody that touches her, and they would have to tackle her to the ground and put her in handcuffs just to keep her from hurting herself. Both sisters would be transported to the hospital, and when they got there, they both apparently were acting normal again. Ursula, because of her broken legs, would be admitted to the hospital, and apparently she would stay normal and would eventually make a recovery and would be released. There were no charges pressed against her. As for Sabina, the doctors checked her out, and she didn't appear to have any injuries. So they released her, and she was brought to the police station to be charged for punching the police officer in the face. That day, Sabina would plead guilty to her charges and would be sentenced to 1 day in custody that she served that night. The next day, she was released. So Sabina leaves the police station on foot, and later that night, she's walking down the road when she sees two men walking towards her who were named Glenn and Peter. She stops them and she says, "Hey, I'm looking for a bed and breakfast. Are there any good ones nearby?" And Glenn would say, "It's funny, I own a bed and breakfast. You can stay at mine." Initially, Sabina seemed hesitant, like perhaps this was a trap, but ultimately she agrees, and the three of them go back to Glenn's B&B. Once they got there, Sabina apparently was constantly looking out all of the windows, acting very paranoid. And then at one point, she offers the men a cigarette, and the men accept, and she hands them their cigarette, and she's about to light their cigarettes when she suddenly snatches them out of their mouths and says, "Oh, these might be poisoned," and she throws them in the trash. Just before midnight, Peter leaves, and Glenn and Sabina go to sleep in their respective rooms. The next day, Glenn gets up to make tea and food for Sabina, who's downstairs in the kitchen, but Glenn realizes he's out of tea bags. So he goes outside and he hollers to his neighbor Frank and says, "Hey, can I borrow some tea bags?" Frank gives him the tea bags. Glenn goes back inside. About a minute later, Frank recalls seeing Glenn stagger out of the B&B, clutching his stomach, screaming, "She stabbed me." And apparently his last words were, "Frank, take care of my dog," before he ultimately died. Frank immediately calls the police, and Sabina immediately leaves the B&B and takes off running. She gets to a highway and she's running along the side of this highway, and a motorist named Josh sees Sabina running, and she's clutching a hammer that she's repeatedly hitting herself in the head with as she's running. Josh drives well past her and gets out to try to intercept her, but as she's running past him, she pulls a roof tile out of her pocket and throws it and hits Josh in the head. She runs past Josh, who's now clutching his head and can't stop her. She gets to this bridge that overlooks another road, and she leaps off. It's 40 feet to the ground, and when she hits the ground, she breaks both ankles and fractures her skull, but she lives and narrowly escapes being hit by another car. Eventually, police and paramedics are called, who transfer Sabina to a hospital where she once again is acting totally normal. Nothing like the crazy person that killed Glenn or was throwing roof tiles just hours earlier. Sabina would ultimately be arrested for murdering Glenn, and she would plead guilty to manslaughter, but she gave absolutely no explanation of why any of this happened. It was like she didn't understand and was a different person now. The defense claimed that although Sabina certainly killed Glenn, she should have diminished responsibility because she was suffering from a condition known as folie à deux. It's a French term that means madness of two, and basically it only presents itself in identical twins where one twin has a psychotic break and they transmit their insanity to the other twin. And amazingly, the prosecution accepted this claim, and they only gave Sabina 5 years for her crimes. Sabina would serve her 5-year sentence and was released in 2011, and to this day is a free woman. Here are some highlights from that film crew that captured Ursula and Sabina acting totally crazy on the side of the highway. In June of 2011, law student Lauren Giddings was only one test away from completing her dream and becoming a public defender. Even though she had a ton of studying still to do, she had taken off the first week in June to go to her sister's wedding where she was the maid of honor. Right before she left the wedding to go back to school, she joked with her family that she was going to be locking herself in the library and just studying 24/7 and that nobody should get in touch with her. But when she got back to campus, none of her classmates that she studied with saw her at the library. And in fact, when they didn't see her for a couple of days, they started reaching out to her and texting her and calling her to see if she was okay. But she never picked up, she never wrote back, and so no one knew what was going on with her. One of Lauren's classmates would reach out to Lauren's sister and would ask her, hey, have you talked to your sister at all? Because we haven't seen her. And Lauren's sister would write back and say, oh no, everything is just fine. Lauren told us before she left the wedding that she was going to be locking herself away and just studying 24/7, so I'm sure everything is just fine. But this classmate wasn't convinced because this felt very uncharacteristic of Lauren to not study at the library and then not to pick up any phone calls or text messages. So she would call the police and say, hey, can you please go check on Lauren's apartment because I think something's wrong. So a police officer goes over to Lauren's apartment and knocks on the door. Lauren doesn't answer. They try the door, it's locked. The officer goes outside and looks around the outside of her apartment. There's no broken windows. There's no obvious signs of a break-in. And so the officer leaves and says, I can't do anything else unless you guys file a missing person report. So a couple of days go by and there's still no word from Lauren. And at this point, Lauren's family is now concerned and they do file a missing persons report. So the police go back to Lauren's apartment. They try knocking. She doesn't come to the door. The door is still locked. So they get the owner of the apartment building to open up her door. And when they go inside, Lauren's not in there, and at first, it doesn't seem like anything is wrong until they notice her cell phone, her keys, her purse, and her laptop are all still in there. This made the police think there could be something sinister happening here, and so they went to Lauren's friends and family and they asked, does she have any enemies? Does she have any reason to be fearful for her life? Initially, they said no one would want to harm Lauren. Everybody loves Lauren. But Lauren's sister would say to the police that there was actually one comment Lauren made a year ago that now seemed a little bit more relevant. Lauren had just got back from a vacation and she noticed there were things in her apartment that seemed like they had been moved, like someone else had been here, but no one was supposed to be in her apartment. And so she told her sister, and the two of them talked about it a little bit, but it was quickly forgotten about because there wasn't a reasonable explanation, and Lauren was so busy with school, she didn't pursue it. After police have done a thorough investigation of the inside of Lauren's apartment, they move outside of her apartment and begin scanning the exterior of the building, and they make a huge discovery. An officer who was looking in the dumpster noticed this big black trash bag that looked out of place, and when he tried to move it, it was very heavy, and when they opened it, they found a human torso, and it was Lauren's. Right before this discovery was made, a news crew had shown up outside the apartment building and was trying to interview people that lived in the apartment complex because they had been tipped off that somebody who was living here had been missing for over a week and now police were getting involved. They saw what looked like a resident of the building looking visibly shaken up, watching the police doing their investigation, and they went over to interview him. It would turn out his name was Stephen McDaniel and he was Lauren's neighbor and he was a classmate of hers in law school. The interviewer asked Stephen, what was your last interaction with Lauren? And Stephen became really focused on how he had not seen her in the last week. And in fact, speaking on behalf of my other classmates, no one's seen her. She must have just vanished. As they're doing this interview, right on the other side of a bush, this police officer discovers Lauren's torso, and the news kind of gets out to the interviewer, they've found a body. And the interviewer says out loud to Stephen, it looks like they found a body. And Stephen just completely changes and he goes, a body? And then he goes completely silent to the point where the interviewer says, are you okay? And he just stands there looking completely distant before walking away from the interviewer, sitting down with his back turned and hyperventilates before the interview ends. Once this case went from missing person to homicide, the police started searching all the rooms on Lauren's floor. And Stephen's room is right next to Lauren's, so he was the first room they searched. Apparently, as they began searching his room, he was standing just outside the door and sweating profusely and drank over 10 bottles of water. In his apartment, they found a key to Lauren's apartment. And what he would do is whenever she was gone, he would sneak into her room and download her hard drive, as well as steal little souvenirs like small art articles of clothing and other things that he would hoard in his apartment. When they went on Stephen's computer and checked his browser history, basically the only things he did on the internet were look at Lauren's Facebook and LinkedIn profiles. But the creepiest thing they found was this camera that was literally duct taped to this long pole. And on the camera were all these surveillance videos of Lauren, because what he would do is he would go outside and he would hoist up this camera and he would film her through her windows in the middle of the night. Stephen was quickly charged with Lauren's murder, to which he pled guilty, and he would openly confess to the details of how she died in court. Most times, he used this surveillance footage to confirm she was not in her apartment so he could sneak in and steal from her. But on the day she was murdered, he would use that camera technique to confirm she was home. And shortly after confirming she was in fact home and asleep, he put on a mask and used his key to get into her apartment and walked right into her room, which woke her up. According to Stephen, she apparently sat up and said, "You need to leave." At this point, he jumps on the bed, and in their struggle, his mask would come off, and Lauren would recognize it's clearly Stephen, and she would plead with him by name to stop. But he didn't stop, and he would strangle her to death. Afterwards, he dragged her into the bathroom and began cutting her up into fairly small pieces. Some of those pieces got flushed down the toilet. The others were put in bags, and only one of those bags was ever discovered, and that was the one of her torso. Stephen was ultimately given a life sentence. Here is a highlight of Stephen's interview when it's revealed that they've discovered Lauren's body.
No one has seen her since Saturday. I haven't seen anything. I've always heard noise outside, but it's just people walking by pretty much. We just don't know where she is.
What about in the parking lot area? I know they've been doing a lot of, I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there.
Body?
Had you seen anything there? Had you seen anything there? I mean, we don't know if this is the same person. You know what I mean? Like, they took out a body there earlier. We don't know if it's the same person or not. So that's why we're trying to ask people if they know who lived there. Are you okay, sir?
I think I need to sit down.
Okay.